For centuries, children have sung these words without suspicion. A sheep, a bag of wool, a simple melody. Baa, baa, black sheep. But what if one of the most innocent nursery rhymes ever repeated was hiding something far older? Taxation, power, and a kingdom that took more than it gave. Because in medieval England, wool was not just fabric. It built fortunes, funded wars, and decided who held power. Then the rhyme begins to sound different. Baa, baa, black sheep, have you any wool? Yes, sir, yes, sir. 3 bags full. 3 bags. And according to one theory, each one may already have belonged to someone else. The strangest part is this. Every line may point to someone who took a share. So if everyone received wool, who was left with nothing? To answer that, let's go back to the beginning. Long before factories rose over cities, before coal darkened the sky, before empire stretched across oceans, England began building power through something far quieter. Not iron, not silver, not even gold, but wool. A material so ordinary in appearance that it is easy to forget how deeply it once shaped an entire kingdom. In medieval England, sheep were more than livestock. They were economic survival. Their wool moved through villages, monasteries, noble estates, and trading ports with a value that reached far beyond the field where it began. Entire communities lived by its rhythm. A successful shearing season could sustain a household. A poor one could leave families exposed to hunger, debt, or dependence. And while farmers worked the land, the true importance of wool was already being measured elsewhere, in markets, in ledgers, and in royal attention. Across Europe, English wool developed a reputation that few resources could rival. Merchants traveled from distant regions not for finished cloth, but for raw fleece itself, because what left English soil could return transformed into wealth many times greater. The softness of wool hid the hardness of what it represented. Trade routes expanded because of it. Land increased in value because of it. And those who controlled enough sheep could influence far more than agriculture. Before England learned to dominate through ships or industry, it learned that power could begin in something silent, renewable, and constantly growing on the backs of animals. That is what makes this rhyme suddenly feel less innocent. Because when one material becomes this valuable, it never remains simple for long. It begins to attract rules, taxes, ownership, claims. And once a kingdom understands where wealth truly comes from, it rarely leaves that wealth untouched. Before factories, before industry, before empire, England's strength had a softer beginning. But softness did not make it gentle. Because if wool was wealth, then controlling wool meant controlling people. Wealth rarely remains unnoticed for long. Once a kingdom discovers what sustains its economy, the next question is never whether it will protect that resource, but who will claim authority over it. And in medieval England, that moment arrived when wool stopped being simply a product of labor and became a source of state control. By the late 13th century, English wool had already become one of the most desired materials in Europe. It moved through ports, crossed borders, and entered foreign markets where its value multiplied far beyond what most shepherds would ever see. But the farther wool traveled, the more visible its profit became to the crown. And profit that becomes visible to power rarely remains untouched. That is where Edward I enters the story. Edward I ruled during a period when monarchy required constant funding, military campaigns, political expansion, administration, and the growing cost of maintaining authority. Kingdoms did not survive on prestige alone. They required income, and few resources offered revenue as reliably as wool. In 1275, a major customs duty was formally imposed on wool exports. The tax was not symbolic, it was systematic. A fixed payment was demanded on every exported sack, turning each movement of wool into a transaction the crown could monitor and profit from. For merchants, this meant heavier cost before trade even began. For exporters, profit narrowed before ships left port. And for those at the beginning of the chain, the people raising sheep, the consequences reached quietly but deeply. Because taxation at the top always travels downward. A shepherd might still shear the same fleece. A farmer might still fill the same sacks. But what returned to them no longer reflected what left their hands. The value had already been interrupted. already divided, already spoken for. That is what made wool dangerous in a way grain or livestock often were not. It connected ordinary labor directly to royal appetite, and once that connection existed, every sheep carried more than wool. It carried obligation, it carried calculation, it carried invisible claims made before the fleece even reached market. For the farmer, one sheep no longer simply meant survival. It no longer meant that one season of labor could secure one household through another winter. It meant that before the wool was sold, before the money was counted, someone else had already measured what portion belonged elsewhere. That shift changes how the nursery rhyme sounds. Because once wealth is divided by authority, simple words begin to feel structured, almost deliberate, almost coded, one for the master, one for the dame, and one for the little boy who lives down the lane. Baa Baa Black Sheep. The lines are short, but what they suggest has lasted for centuries. The master is often read as authority, someone above the labor itself, someone entitled to receive without producing. The dame has been interpreted in different ways. Sometimes the church, sometimes the household of privilege, sometimes another figure whose position grants a share without visible effort. And then there is the little boy down the lane, the smallest figure in the rhyme, the one whose share appears almost incidental, yet his presence complicates everything. Because why name 3 recipients at all? Why divide the wool so precisely? Why make distribution the center of a children's rhyme unless division itself already mattered? Some historians caution against reading too much into these lines. The rhyme appeared in written form centuries after the tax itself, and no surviving document confirms that it was created as protest or commentary. But that uncertainty is exactly why the theory survives. Because the structure fits too neatly to disappear. 3 bags, 3 recipients. A resource so economically important that nearly everyone above the producer had reason to claim part of it. And once that pattern is noticed, the rhyme becomes difficult to hear in the same way again. The words remain simple, but beneath them sits a world where value moved upward faster than it returned. A world where labor began in the field, but ownership expanded far beyond it. And perhaps that is why the rhyme endured. Because songs often preserve what records do not. Not exact events, but emotional memory, a shape of reality reduced until even children can carry it forward without knowing what survives inside it. So the question remains, was this merely a song or a quiet map of where the wool went? The deeper this rhyme is examined, the more unusual its simplicity becomes, because nothing in it is descriptive by accident. Every line is brief, every word is functional, and that economy of language is exactly what makes interpretation so persistent. The rhyme gives almost nothing, yet suggests more than it explains. It begins with the image that has survived longest. Baa Baa Black Sheep. Sheep. At first the phrase feels harmless. A child hears an animal sound before anything else. The sheep announces itself before the question begins. But even here, the wording raises a quiet question. Why black? Because if the rhyme only needed a sheep, color was not necessary. And yet the color remains central. So central that it became the defining identity of the animal itself. Historically, black sheep were real and naturally occurring. Not rare, but distinct enough to stand apart within flocks dominated by lighter wool. Their fleece behaved differently in trade. Unlike white wool, black wool could not easily be dyed into brighter commercial colors. White fleece allowed merchants and cloth makers greater flexibility because it accepted treatment and transformation more easily. Black wool resisted that process. It arrived already marked, already limited in what it could become. That sometimes made it less commercially desirable in markets where adaptability increased value. And that creates a subtle irony. The rhyme may begin with a sheep whose wool exists, but whose worth may already be considered imperfect. A resource present, yet treated differently because of what cannot be changed about it. That symbolism became stronger over time. Long after the medieval wool trade, the phrase black sheep began carrying another meaning. Not simply a sheep of darker fleece, but a figure of difference, someone set apart, someone within the group yet not fully accepted by it, someone who belongs but carries a mark that changes how they are seen. That later meaning may not explain the rhyme's origin, but it changes how modern ears hear it. Because suddenly the sheep is not just producing value. It is producing value while already identified by difference. And then comes the question, have you any wool? The wording sounds polite, almost casual, but beneath that politeness sits a structure of authority, because this is not a sheep offering wool. It is being asked to account for what it has. And once the rhyme is placed inside a world shaped by taxation, ownership, and economic control, the question begins to sound less innocent. Who is asking? A merchant waiting to buy? A landlord checking what is owed? A collector measuring what belongs to the crown? An authority figure ensuring that nothing leaves uncounted? The rhyme never tells us, and that silence matters. Because the sheep does not ask why. It does not hesitate. It answers immediately. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. The response is immediate obedience, not negotiation, not uncertainty, recognition. The word sir introduces hierarchy at once. Someone above asks, someone below answers. And what follows is not merely possession, but inventory. 3 bags full, 3. That number has sustained the theory more than any other line. Because the rhyme does not say some wool, it does not say enough wool. It gives a count, a measured amount, a quantity already prepared for division. And once the next lines arrive, the 3 bags stop sounding random. They begin to resemble allocation, a resource separated before ownership is complete. One part already imagined for one hand, another for another, a third for someone else entirely. That is where tension quietly enters the rhyme. Because if the sheep produces the wool, why is the answer already organized around distribution? Why is the first detail not abundance, but division? The structure suggests something larger than possession. It suggests expectation, as though the wool was never fully the sheep's, or symbolically, never fully the producer's, to begin with. And that is why every line starts to feel suspicious. Not because it proves hidden history, but because the language behaves as if counting already mattered. As if somewhere behind the rhyme sits a world where what is produced must immediately be explained in terms of who receives what. And once that possibility is heard, even the smallest lines begin to feel less like a song and more like a record disguised as simplicity. The rhyme is deceptively simple. One for the master, one for the dame, and one for the little boy who lives down the lane. 3 lines, 3 recipients, and yet within them lies a quiet social hierarchy that echoes centuries of economic power. At first glance, they seem harmless, characters in a story, but the theory suggests something far darker. These 3 figures may represent a map of wealth and authority, a distribution system hidden in plain sight. Master. The master is the first to receive. Who is the master? Some say the landlord, the one who owns the land, but does not sow the seeds or shear the wool. The master represents authority over labor, the one who claims reward without producing it, the figure who measures wealth in terms of control rather than work. Every economy has someone like this, and in medieval England, that person often stood above the farmer, above the shepherd, and above the small village household. Dame. The dame follows. But who is she? The church? A noble household? A figure whose claim exists because of social structure? Her share is not earned in the field. It comes from tradition, influence, and the expectation of entitlement. The dame symbolizes another layer of power, a claim that is invisible yet unavoidable. In a kingdom fueled by wool, such claims could decide whether a family survived winter or went hungry. Little boy. And then the little boy down the lane. Small, almost incidental, yet named. Some interpret him as a poor villager, a laborer, or even the shepherd's child, the one whose portion is the least, yet must still exist. His inclusion speaks volumes. Every social layer receives something, but in uneven measure. Alternative interpretation. Other historians take a broader lens. Master equals the king himself, dame equals the church boy, equals the shepherd. From this perspective, the rhyme encodes the absolute hierarchy of medieval life. Not a story about a single sheep, but about the very structure of society. Every bale of wool had already been claimed before the shepherd could benefit from it. The missing farmer, and here lies the tension. The part that twists the stomach in subtle ways. If the farmer raised the sheep, why is he never mentioned? He labored, he invested, he endured the seasons, and yet the rhyme erases him. He exists only in the shadow of others' claims. This absence is not accidental. It mirrors the lived reality of a system where production belongs to the worker, but reward belongs elsewhere. Suddenly, the rhyme is no longer just a nursery song. It becomes a quiet protest disguised as simplicity, a record of imbalance sung by generations of children who never knew the weight of the world in those words. And that is where the theory becomes emotionally provocative. It asks the audience to notice injustice hidden in something familiar. It sparks debate. Was this intentional? Coincidental? A reflection of memory? It challenges us to hear the song differently, to question who benefits and who is erased. Because anyone who grew up singing the rhyme is now forced to ask, did we all unknowingly repeat the story of a world where the worker never truly owned what they produced? It is a question that lingers, that invites comment, and that makes the simplest rhyme feel like a complex moral record. Every story this neat invites skepticism, because history, like wool in medieval England, can be tangled, frayed, and selectively preserved. For centuries, the idea that Baa Baa Black Sheep hides a record of taxation and hierarchy has fascinated listeners. Yet when we search for evidence, the trail grows cold. No medieval ledger, no official decree, no contemporary note confirms that the rhyme was ever a comment on wool taxes. The earliest printed version of the rhyme appears not in Edward I's England, but centuries later, in Tommy Thumb's Pretty Song Book. By then, the political, economic, and social context of the 13th century had already been layered with centuries of interpretation, folklore, and oral transmission. And that is where the story becomes both fascinating and unsettling. Many nursery rhyme hidden meanings are, by nature, retroactive. Scholars often trace them back to historical events that neatly fit the rhyme structure, reading intention where none may have existed. But here, the structure is so precise, so perfectly divided into three recipients, that it begs the question, coincidence or memory, which raises a deeper possibility. Maybe this rhyme did not begin as protest. Maybe it was never intended to highlight injustice, hierarchy, or exploitation. Maybe it was a simple counting song, a memory aid, a game. Yet later generations, listening to the rhyme with knowledge of taxes, social hierarchy, and historical injustice, found meaning in the lines anyway. They heard what fit. They gave it political weight. They turned innocence into commentary. And that is the tension that holds the rhyme in history's gaze. It is both known and unknown, fact and interpretation, childhood memory and adult reflection, playful song and potential social record. We cannot say with certainty that the rhyme began as a map of power, yet we also cannot ignore that it fits the pattern so perfectly that even centuries later, we feel it might have. This ambiguity is not a weakness. It is the point, because the mystery forces us to listen differently. It forces us to consider, what if something we sing casually today carries the echoes of injustice, hierarchy, and control, even if only because history shaped us to hear it that way? And that question is what keeps the story alive, provoking debate, reflection, and curiosity. It is the moment where history stops being static and becomes a conversation, one that generations of listeners are still participating in centuries after the sheep was first counted. Even when evidence is thin, the theory persists. Why? Because nursery rhymes are not just songs. They are vessels of memory. They survive where books crumble, where records are lost, and where official history forgets the lives of ordinary people. Their language is simple. Their melodies are easy to repeat. Their words are short enough for a child to sing, but long enough to carry meaning across centuries. And meaning has a strange way of surviving. Even when people forget the origin, the structure remains. The pattern endures. The counting, the distribution, the repeated obedience. And with every repetition, the rhyme whispers its story anew. One for the master, one for the dame, and one for the little boy who lives down the lane. The lines are small, but their echo is powerful. People may forget the names of kings, the details of taxes, the dates of decrees, but they remember the song. They remember the order. They remember the division. And in doing so, they carry forward a memory of social structure, of who claimed, who received, and who was left invisible. Sometimes history survives not in books, but in what children repeat day after day without knowing why. A nursery rhyme becomes more than a game. It becomes a mirror of power, of hierarchy, of human tendency to divide and claim. And that is why the theory endures. Not because we can prove it, not because it was written in stone, but because repetition itself preserves fragments of truth. Fragments that speak louder than any document ever could. Perhaps Baa Baa Black Sheep was never meant to accuse anyone. Perhaps it was just a simple rhyme for children. Or perhaps it was born in a world where uncomfortable truths had to be hidden in plain sight. A world where labor could be measured, where wealth could be taken before it was earned, where one sheep could tell a story far larger than its fleece. A sheep, 3 bags, and a kingdom where even wool had already been counted, divided, and claimed before it reached the hands that worked for it. Every repetition of the rhyme carries that memory, whether we realize it or not. So when you hear it now, do you hear a children's song, playful and innocent? Or do you hear something else, a record of authority, hierarchy, and quiet injustice disguised as music? The answer may be different for everyone, and that is the power of a rhyme that has survived centuries. It whispers a question, and it waits for us to answer. What do you hear?